This is the story of a Nazi hunt like no other. The target was Heinrich Himmler, head of the dreaded SS and Gestapo, the mastermind behind the final solution, the murder of 6 million Jews, making him probably the worst war criminal the world has ever known. Towards the end of the war, he had more people hunting him than anyone else. They included Allied secret agents who were out to kill him, war crimes investigators who were determined to catch him alive and put him on trial, and lastly, Adolf Hitler himself. Convinced that Himmler had betrayed him, he wanted him arrested and executed. It all meant that when Himmler was finally caught, what happened next would spark off 1,000 conspiracy theories, each more extraordinary than the last.
In the house, Himmler admitted his identity and soon afterwards lay dead. The man who, after Hitler, killed and tortured more human beings than anyone in the history of the world, dared not face the consequences.
This is the bizarre story of the hunt for Heinrich Himmler, the most evil Nazi of them all. Late April 1945, Berlin, the once proud capital of Germany, lay in ruins. Russian forces rampaged through the streets. The Third Reich, which Adolf Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years, was on the verge of collapse. Yet on April the 20th, in the midst of all this chaos, Hitler chose to celebrate his 56th birthday. He emerged briefly from his underground bunker to meet some of the young boys left to defend Berlin. The occasion marked the last gathering of the Nazi hierarchy. The guests included Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, Martin Bormann, Hitler's closest aide, and Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Gestapo, Germany's secret police. As the Russians moved in, the few top Nazis who remained with Hitler were faced with a stark choice: surrender, escape, or suicide. Most chose to run away. However, Himmler, an inveterate schemer, saw the disaster as a major opportunity for his own advancement. For the last few weeks, as enemy troops stormed through Germany, he'd been trying to open up secret peace negotiations with the British and the Americans. Using Count Volker Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat, as an intermediary, he'd gone behind Hitler's back. Himmler had persuaded himself he was so important that the Allies were bound to do a deal with him. They might allow him to govern a small part of Germany, even establish a Fourth Reich. On April the 23rd, 3 days after Hitler's birthday, Himmler sent a message of surrender to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. It was passed on to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the US President Harry S. Truman. They in turn informed the Russian leader, Joseph Stalin. All three decided to ignore Himmler. And in doing so, they turned the tables on him. On April the 28th, news of Himmler's secret overtures was broadcast on BBC Radio.
It has been reported by Reuters that unconditional surrender was offered by Himmler to Britain and the United States only.
Hitler was stunned. Hitler demanded that Himmler, once one of his closest colleagues, was arrested and shot. On April the 30th, Hitler, after ranting about being surrounded by traitors and incompetents, killed himself. Eva Braun, his wife of just a few hours, died alongside him. Their bodies were then taken to the surface and cremated.
Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that, Hitler is dead.
This was good news for Himmler. He was now 200 miles away from Berlin in Plön, a small town near the Baltic coast, trying to ingratiate himself with Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German forces in the north. With the death of Hitler, Himmler had one less person after him, but it was only a temporary reprieve. Three days later, with British forces just 30 miles from Plön, Himmler, along with what remained of the German High Command, shifted further north, to Flensburg, a port close to the Danish border. The whole country was swarming with enemy troops, and Himmler had now moved to the top of the Allies' most wanted list. They were determined to catch him alive. So who was Heinrich Himmler, the man the Allies were after? He was born in Munich on October the 7th, 1900, the second son of a school teacher and a devout Roman Catholic mother. Following the outbreak of World War I in 1914, he yearned to become a soldier. But because he was only 14, Himmler had to wait until the late summer of 1917 before he could join up. In fact, he had barely completed his basic training before the war ended with Germany's defeat in November 1918. Himmler was shattered by his country's humiliation. He was determined that one day he would play a part in restoring Germany's pride. In 1919, Himmler settled back into normal life and began studying agriculture at college in Munich. Graduating 3 years later, he went on to buy and run a small chicken farm. By now, the German economy lay in ruins. Inflation was soaring out of control, businesses folded, unemployment rocketed, and people watched helplessly as their life savings were wiped out. Thousands took to the streets in a series of angry protests. Himmler was horrified as the country hovered on the brink of total collapse. But then, out of the chaos, a man emerged who promised to rebuild the country and make Germany great again.
Seit dem Tag hat sich von Woche um Woche steigend unsere Flagge zum Symbol des deutschen Volkes und Reiches erhoben.
His name? Adolf Hitler, a charismatic ex-World War I corporal who headed up the fledgling National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Hitler was quick to tap into people's fear, frustration, and misery. He promised to bring about order and stability as well as rebuilding Germany's shattered military machine. Himmler was enthralled by Hitler's barnstorming rhetoric and his vision of the future, signing up as a party member in August 1923. Three months later, he enthusiastically joined in an ill-conceived attempt by the Nazis to overthrow the German government by force. The attempt, known as the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, failed, and Hitler was briefly jailed. When the Nazi leader was released, Himmler threw himself into his work for the party. His painstaking attention to detail and his gift for organization was soon noticed. It was obvious he was a born administrator. In 1925, he was appointed the Nazis' deputy Gauleiter, or regional leader in Bavaria. The following year saw Himmler as second in command of the recently formed SS, a small but elite group of men whose main job was to protect Hitler. Then in January 1929, much to the surprise of his colleagues, Himmler was personally promoted by Hitler to Reichsführer, or commander, of the SS. The one-time chicken farmer was on the fast track to the top of the Nazi Party. Now he was in overall charge. Himmler set about building up the SS with ruthless efficiency. He was so single-minded that by the time Hitler eventually became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, the SS had grown from fewer than 300 members to more than 50,000. Its recruits were fanatically loyal and blindly obedient Nazis, all meeting Himmler's warped criteria as racially pure Aryans. They not only had to be physically fit and strong, they also had to be able to trace their German ancestry back to the beginning of the 19th century. In March 1933, Himmler set up Germany's first concentration camp at Dachau, near Munich. It was established to house so-called political dissidents, including communists, trade union leaders, and other opponents of the Nazi regime. Conditions at Dachau were harsh. Deaths were frequent, as prisoners were forced to work until they dropped, subjected to savage beatings, and starved of proper food. By now, Himmler was an important member of Hitler's inner circle. Even so, he still wanted to grab more power for himself. But first he had to overcome a major obstacle. Himmler's SS was technically subordinate to the SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary arm. This vast and unruly militia, known as the Brown Shirts, was headed by Ernst Röhm, a close friend of Hitler. Himmler was determined to cut his rival down to size. So, on June 30th, 1934, in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Himmler orchestrated a bloody purge of the SA. Hundreds of its senior members were rounded up, flung in jail, or summarily executed on trumped-up charges of treason. Among them was Ernst Röhm. After being persuaded by Himmler that his old friend was plotting against him, Hitler turned a blind eye as he was shot dead in a Munich prison cell. With Röhm out of the way, the field was now clear for Himmler's SS to become the most powerful organization of its kind in Germany. Then in June 1936, Hitler gave Himmler complete control of Nazi Germany's internal security apparatus, including the much-feared secret police, the Gestapo. He now had the authority to become fully involved in Hitler's campaign of hate against the Jews. Persecuted by Himmler's SS and Gestapo thugs, thousands of Jews were forced to flee abroad, leaving everything they owned behind. Their businesses and homes were then taken over by the Nazis, who enriched both themselves and the party in the process. Those Jews who chose to remain in Germany were treated appallingly. Relationships between Jews and non-Jews resulted in public humiliation for both parties. Jewish culture was derided, and books by Jewish authors were burnt in great public bonfires. Soon Himmler was able to spread this anti-Semitic policy even further, and on a much more violent scale. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. As Germany extended its territory eastward, Hitler and his government were faced with a new problem. They had just acquired millions of extra people, many of them Jews. So what was to be done? The answer was chillingly simple: kill them. And who better to get things underway than Hitler's loyal Reichsführer, Heinrich Himmler. His carefully planned program of mass murder began by sending in SS death squads called Einsatzgruppen. They roamed throughout Eastern Europe and Russia, killing Jews, communists, and anyone else Himmler and his cronies considered subhuman. Thousands of helpless men, women, and children were rounded up and marched off to execution sites. This gave Himmler a new problem. How could he get rid of large numbers of Jews without upsetting too many of his SS killers? He had to find another and more efficient way of getting rid of them. The outcome was one of history's greatest crimes. It would be known as the final solution: the systematic murder of millions of Jews. Himmler authorized the construction of a network of huge extermination camps in Eastern Europe. They included Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, and the most notorious of them all, Auschwitz. They were built with just one purpose in mind: the murder of millions of innocent people. Jews were now rounded up throughout the occupied territories, forced onto cattle trains, and transported to Himmler's new death camps. With no food, no water, and packed tight together, a great many, particularly the young, the old, and the sick, died on the way. On arrival at the camps, those who survived the journey were deprived of their few possessions. Families were separated. People considered strong enough to work were sent one way. The rest were shorn of their hair, stripped naked, and told they were about to take a shower. This was a cruel deception. They were headed for the gas chambers and their death. The victims left behind piles of clothes, shoes, spectacles, even toys. Everything, including gold teeth taken from the corpses, was then recycled for the benefit of the Third Reich. Himmler's extermination camps were big business. Himmler was presiding over unimaginable suffering. However, unlike some of his subordinates, he was rather squeamish. Once, as he watched a mass execution, he'd even fainted. He preferred to remain in his office, regarding the organization of wholesale slaughter as no more than a bureaucratic exercise. On June the 6th, 1944, D-Day, the Western Allies landed in northern France and headed for Germany. Meanwhile, the Russians steadily moved in from the east. And on July the 23rd, they became the first of the Allies to liberate an extermination camp, Majdanek, on the outskirts of the city of Lublin in East Poland. They were dumbfounded by what confronted them, especially the gas chambers. Although the Allies knew they existed, no one had actually seen one before.
Polish and Allied observers visited Majdanek, they found 6 gas chambers disguised as shower baths. Zyklon, this is the gas the Germans used to kill innocent men and women by the thousand. Having killed their victims, the Germans burned them in special incinerators.
Faced with such damning evidence, Himmler now became a prime target for the Nazi hunters. Though at this stage no one wanted to catch him alive, they wanted him dead. On July the 8th, 1944, a top-secret memo went round a London office. The memo discussed the possible assassination of Hitler and Himmler using agents from the Special Operations Executive, better known as SOE. Established by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in July 1940, SOE had been ordered to set Europe ablaze. Sometimes referred to as Churchill's secret army, SOE agents were recruited from all walks of life. Following intensive training, the agents became experts in commando warfare, sabotage, handling explosives, and occasionally assassination. The most notable of these took place on May the 29th, 1942, when 2 SOE-trained Czech agents threw a bomb at an official car on the outskirts of Prague. Their target was the Nazi overlord of the region, the notoriously cruel SS General Heinrich Hizinger, a close colleague of Himmler. He died from his injuries the following week. And so 2 years later, SOE launched an even more daring plan, Operation Foxley, the assassination of Hitler and Himmler. With the enthusiastic support of Churchill, SOE came up with a number of scenarios. These included derailing Hitler's train with high explosives, or poisoning the train's water supply. But they were soon dismissed as hopelessly impractical. Eventually, it was decided that the best way to kill Hitler would be by shooting him on one of his regular visits to the Berghof, his Bavarian mountain retreat. SOE planned to parachute snipers into the area surrounding the Berghof compound. Acting on information relayed to them by a man on the inside, the snipers, dressed in German army uniforms, would sneak into the compound and lie in wait until Hitler and Himmler appeared in the grounds. The weapon chosen for the attack was a KAR-98K, a standard-issue German infantry rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. And to make sure they got their men, the snipers would use explosive bullets. The plan was submitted to the British War Cabinet in November 1944. While waiting for a decision, SOE came up with yet another proposal. It involved using a top Nazi.
In aufrichtiger Kameradschaft begrüßt die Bewegung besonders die Vertreter. Sie sind uns der Garant des Friedens. Adolf Hitler! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Rudolf Hess had once been Hitler's deputy. But in 1941 he had fallen into Allied hands after a failed attempt to negotiate peace terms.
We're sure you'd like to hear a bit more about that nice Mr. Rudolf Hess. Of course, we haven't been allowed to take any pictures of him, but this is Dungavel Castle, the house of the Duke of Hamilton, on whom Hess intended to call. This is the hospital in Glasgow, where he went first of all, but where he isn't now. And then we have the farmhouse near which he landed, but he isn't there either. This is the plane in which he made his astonishing flight from Nazi Germany to Scotland, but he isn't among the pieces, and you can say what you think about that.
In fact, there was no mystery surrounding his whereabouts. When he came down by parachute, Hess was picked up almost immediately and placed under close guard in a secluded country house. But now SOE wanted to use Hess in a plan so bizarre it bordered on fantasy. To hypnotize him and spirit him back to Germany. On the assumption that he would be welcomed once more into the Nazi inner circle, Hess would have been programmed to kill Himmler as soon as he got the opportunity. Needless to say, the mad scheme didn't get off the drawing board. By now Churchill had gone off Operation Foxley. He felt that as Hitler was such a bad military commander, he was worth more alive than dead. The last thing anyone wanted at this late stage in the war was Hitler being replaced by someone who actually knew what he was doing. Any idea of killing Himmler was also abandoned. By now the Allies had other plans for him. He was to be put on trial for his life. On May the 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered.
Now the surrenders began. Admiral General von Friedeberg signed the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany and Holland and Denmark. For Field Marshal Montgomery, this was the victorious end of a march from Alamein to the Elbe.
As Allied troops swarmed all over the country, they were ordered to keep a lookout for the top Nazis, including Himmler. The Allies intended to put them on trial for war crimes. It would be the first tribunal of its kind ever held. As thousands of German troops laid down their arms, they were all rigorously processed. The Allies were determined to get their hands on the masterminds behind the genocide. At this stage, Himmler was still hiding out in Flensburg, near the Danish border, since Hitler's death the seat of the short-lived provisional German government. Realizing he was a prime target, he decided to go on the run. But first, he tried to change his appearance by shaving off his moustache and wearing an eye patch instead of his spectacles. Himmler now intended making his way south to Munich, his hometown, where he hoped to meet up with his family. The escape from Flensburg to Munich would involve traveling hundreds of miles through territory now firmly in Allied hands. Accompanied by a small group of his most trusted SS colleagues, Himmler set off. By now, Allied agents, alerted by Danish intelligence that he'd fled, were combing northern Germany for him. With the whole country covered in Allied troops picking up stray Germans, Himmler's progress was slow, and it took the group 2 days to cover just 60 miles. Arriving at Marne on the north bank of the Elbe estuary, they abandoned their cars and continued on foot, managing no more than 5 miles a day. Mixing with thousands of displaced people and German troops trying to find their way home, Himmler and his companions had discarded their distinctive black SS uniforms. They were now masquerading as members of the Geheimfeldpolizei, or secret military field police. But what none of them realized was that the field police, because they were affiliated to the Gestapo, were high on the Allies' blacklist. Anyone with the rank of sergeant or above was subject to automatic arrest. They'd made a critical error. On the morning of May the 21st, Himmler and his companions reached the small town of Bremervörde on the River Ost, halfway between Hamburg and Bremen. But now their luck was about to run out completely. On arrest, the Nazis' false papers were found to be just too perfect, and they were dispatched to an interrogation center a few miles south of the town of Lüneburg. Much to Himmler's surprise, he had not yet been recognized. With no chance of escape, he reviewed his options. He hoped there was still a deal to be done with the Allies, even though they'd rebuffed him earlier. If not, there was another way out. Suicide. In common with most other senior Nazis, Himmler carried a deadly dose of cyanide, which could be hidden inside a hollowed-out tooth. All he needed was the right moment. On arrival at the interrogation center, the prisoners were paraded before the commanding officer, Captain Thomas Sylvester. Noticing something different about Himmler's bearing, Sylvester had the other two removed so he could concentrate on the man left standing in front of him. Realizing there was clearly no longer any chance of a deal, Himmler calmly revealed his true identity. The end game was about to begin. Sylvester immediately contacted British Second Army headquarters in nearby Lüneburg. He was ordered to search the prisoner for suicide capsules. Two small cases were found in Himmler's jacket. One contained a capsule. The second was empty. Sylvester was now seriously alarmed. He had to find the missing capsule. Himmler was then stripped and searched again. But nothing was found. Later the same day, Himmler was taken on to Lüneburg for a more thorough interrogation. As soon as he arrived, he was hustled into the front room of a house commandeered by the military. Himmler was now in the hands of Army Doctor Captain Clement Wells. He'd been instructed to give him a complete examination.
Now, let's have a look at you then. Open wide. Move your tongue.
Wells had spotted something strange in Himmler's mouth.
Again. Wider. Oh, no.
This was the end of Himmler. In this house at Lüneburg, he was interrogated and found to be in possession of poison phials. In the house, Himmler admitted his identity and soon afterwards lay dead from the poison concealed in his mouth. The man who, after Hitler, killed and tortured more human beings than anyone in the history of the world, dared not face the consequences.
Early next morning, Himmler's body was buried in an unmarked grave in a remote spot on Lüneburg Heath. The British had no intention of allowing his last resting place to become a Nazi shrine. And there the matter might have ended, except that from the start, doubts about the exact circumstances of Himmler's death would linger for years afterwards. There are rumours that the British intelligence service files about his last days are sealed until 2045, 100 years after the end of the war. If there is nothing to hide, this seems a remarkably long time and does nothing to dispel the various theories about the way Himmler died. These include the suggestion that once the poison capsule was spotted in his mouth, it was decided to let him go ahead and kill himself. Another is that allowing Himmler to die was an act of sheer negligence by his interrogators, negligence that the authorities wanted hushing up. After all, it's not as if they were unaware that suicide was a real risk. Just 2 days before Himmler's death, the British had lost another high-ranking Nazi, SS General Hans Adolf Prutzmann. While being processed at Lüneburg, he'd killed himself with a cyanide capsule hidden in a cigarette lighter. In an even more bizarre twist, it was suggested later that Himmler had slipped through the net, and the man who died in agony, writhing on the floor, was an imposter. The rumours and speculation continued until 2005, when a British author claimed to have discovered what really happened. In his book, Himmler's Secret War, Martin Allen suggested that far from killing himself, Himmler had actually been assassinated by secret agents, acting with the full knowledge of the British authorities. The reason, according to Allen, was that the British apparently didn't want the Americans to discover the full extent of their negotiations with Himmler. Conspiracy theorists have long since referred to a war cabinet meeting in May 1945, when Churchill apparently suggested negotiating with Himmler before disposing of him. As Churchill is said to have remarked, we were quite entitled to bump him off. Alan based his sensational findings on documents he'd unearthed at the British Public Record Office in Kew, London, in 2003. However, a forensic examination of the documents showed several of them to be forgeries. Alan was convinced someone had set him up. However, the most obvious explanation for Himmler's death still seems to be that he committed suicide. But whatever the circumstances, few mourned the passing of such a monster. A man directly responsible for the cruel deaths of millions of innocent people as he held sway throughout the Third Reich.